the moment human thought shifted forever. In ancient Greece, the first philosophers lit the flame. Picture this: 2,600 years ago, in a bustling coastal city called Miletus, something happened that would change the course of human history forever. For the first time, people dared to look at the world around them and ask a revolutionary question: what if the gods aren't the answer? This wasn't just skepticism. This was the birth of rational thinking, the moment when humanity lit the flame of philosophy and science that still burns today. But here's what's mind-blowing. We're talking about three ordinary men who had the audacity to challenge everything their civilization believed. Their names: Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. And what they discovered didn't just shake the foundations of ancient Greece. It created the intellectual DNA of the modern world. Imagine waking up every morning in a world where nothing makes sense without a god behind it. You see lightning flash across the sky? That's Zeus hurling his thunderbolts in anger. You feel the ground shake beneath your feet? Poseidon is throwing a tantrum in his underwater palace. The sun rises? Helios is driving his golden chariot across the heavens. Every single thing that happened in your life, from the weather to your health, to whether your crops would grow, depended entirely on the whims of powerful human-like gods who could be loving one minute and vindictive the next. This was life in ancient Greece before philosophy existed. This was the world our story begins in, specifically in the city of Miletus around 600 BC. Miletus wasn't just any city. It was like the New York of the ancient world, a massive trading hub where East met West, where cultures collided and merged. Ships arrived daily from Egypt, bringing papyrus and exotic spices. Babylonian merchants traded mathematical knowledge for Greek olive oil. Phoenician traders shared their alphabet while loading up on wine and pottery. Walk through the streets of Miletus, and your senses would be overwhelmed. The salty smell of the sea mixed with the aroma of fresh bread from bakeries. The sounds of hammers on bronze, merchants haggling over prices, and the bleating of goats being led to temple sacrifices. You'd see people in colorful tunics, their skin bronzed by the Mediterranean sun, speaking a dozen different languages as they conducted business. But dominating everything, both physically and mentally, were the temples. Massive stone structures dedicated to the Olympic gods rose above the marketplace like ancient skyscrapers. Inside these temples, people gathered daily to make offerings, burn incense, and desperately try to stay on the good side of the gods who controlled their fate. The Greeks didn't just believe in their gods, they lived in absolute terror of them. These weren't the gentle, loving deities of later religions. The Greek gods were essentially immortal humans, with all the worst human characteristics amplified to cosmic proportions. Zeus was a serial cheater who threw deadly lightning bolts when he got mad. Hera was consumed by jealous rage. Poseidon was moody and unpredictable. Ares loved war and bloodshed. Even Athena, supposedly the goddess of wisdom, was known for her pride and vindictiveness. Your entire life revolved around keeping these gods happy. Bad harvest? You must have offended Demeter. Storm destroyed your ship? Poseidon is punishing you for something. Your child is sick? Maybe you forgot to honor Asclepius properly. Every success, every failure, every twist of fate was directly connected to divine approval or wrath. But here's where it gets interesting. Miletus was different from other Greek cities in one crucial way. It was a melting pot of ideas. When Egyptian traders talked about their gods, they told different stories about the same natural phenomena. When Babylonians explained eclipses, they didn't mention Apollo at all. When Persian merchants described earthquakes, they attributed them to completely different divine beings. Slowly, some of the sharper minds in Miletus began to notice something troubling. If the Egyptians said the Nile flooded because of their gods, and the Greeks said rivers flooded because of their gods, and the Babylonians had entirely different explanations, who was right? Or more unsettling, what if they were all wrong? This is where our story really begins. In this atmosphere of cultural collision and creeping doubt, three men emerged who would dare to ask the unthinkable question. What if there's a natural explanation for everything we see around us? The first of these intellectual revolutionaries was a man named Thales. And Thales was about to propose something so radical that it would mark the beginning of Western philosophy, science, and rational thought as we know it. But before we dive into Thales's world-changing theory, you need to understand just how dangerous what he was doing really was. In a society where questioning the gods could get you ostracized or worse, where every natural event was seen as a divine message suggesting that you could understand the world without appealing to Zeus and his family, was borderline blasphemous. Yet Thales had something most people lacked: the courage to think for himself. Picture Thales walking through the bustling streets of Miletus, watching his fellow citizens rush to temples every time thunder rumbled overhead. He saw them sacrificing precious livestock to gods who never seemed to answer their prayers consistently. He observed how different cultures had completely different explanations for the same phenomena. And slowly, a radical idea began forming in his mind. What if, instead of looking to the heavens for answers, we looked at the world itself? Legend has it that Thales was so lost in thought about the mysteries of the universe that one night, while stargazing, he fell straight into a well. A servant girl who witnessed this couldn't help but laugh, saying, "Here's a man trying to understand what's in the heavens when he can't even see what's at his feet." But this story, whether true or not, captures something essential about Thales. He was a dreamer, yes, but he was also intensely practical. He wasn't some absent-minded professor living in an ivory tower. He was a successful businessman, a skilled mathematician, and someone who understood the material world better than almost anyone of his time, which is exactly what made his theory so revolutionary. As Thales observed the world around him, he noticed something that everyone else seemed to miss. Water was everywhere. Look at your own body. It's mostly water. Every living thing needs water to survive. Plants wilt without it. Animals die without it. Even the seeds that create new life are moist and depend on water to germinate. But Thales saw something even more profound. Water wasn't just important, it was transformative. It could be liquid, flowing in rivers and filling the sea. It could be solid, freezing into ice on cold winter mornings. It could be invisible, rising as vapor from heated surfaces. Water was the only substance he knew that could take all these different forms. And then Thales made a logical leap that changed everything. If water could transform into so many different states, if it was essential for all life, if it surrounded the earth and fell from the sky, what if everything came from water? Think about how radical this was. Thales wasn't just proposing a new theory about one natural phenomenon. He was suggesting that the entire universe, everything that exists, could be explained by a single natural principle. No gods required. Instead of saying Poseidon controls the waters, Thales declared, "Everything is made of water, and water follows natural laws we can understand." When word of this theory spread through Miletus, the reaction was explosive. Some people were fascinated. Others were horrified. Most thought Thales had lost his mind. How could fire come from water? How could solid earth emerge from liquid? How could the infinite diversity of the natural world spring from a single substance? But Thales had thought this through. He pointed out how land appeared when water evaporated, leaving behind sediment. He showed how heat could turn water into vapor, and how that vapor could condense back into water. He explained earthquakes not as Poseidon's anger, but as movements in the vast ocean he believed supported the earth. For the first time in recorded Western history, someone had replaced a mythological explanation with a natural one. The transition from mythos to logos, from story-based thinking to logic-based thinking, had begun. But Thales's revolution didn't stop there. When his fellow citizens mocked him for being an impractical dreamer, he decided to prove them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. Using his knowledge of astronomy, Thales predicted that the olive harvest would be particularly good one year. So he quietly bought up all the olive presses in Miletus and the surrounding area. When harvest time came and olives were plentiful, demand for presses skyrocketed, and Thales rented them out at premium prices, making a fortune. His message was clear. Philosophical thinking isn't just abstract speculation. It's a powerful tool for understanding and predicting the world around us. But Thales was just the beginning. In Miletus, there were other brilliant minds wrestling with the same fundamental questions about reality. And not everyone was convinced that water was the answer. Enter Anaximander, probably a student of Thales, who had been thinking deeply about his teacher's theory. Anaximander saw a fundamental problem with the idea that everything comes from water. If water is the source of everything, Anaximander reasoned, how do you explain fire? Water is cold and wet. How can it possibly give rise to something hot and dry like flames? And what about drought? If water is the principle of all existence, how can there be places and times completely devoid of water? Anaximander realized that any specific element would have these contradictions. If everything came from fire, how would you explain ice? If everything came from earth, how would you explain wind? The first principle couldn't be any particular element. It had to be something else entirely. And so Anaximander proposed something that sounds almost mystical even today, the apeiron. This Greek word means the boundless, the unlimited, the indefinite. Anaximander was suggesting that at the root of all existence wasn't water, fire, earth, or air, but something that couldn't be directly observed or defined, something infinite and without characteristics, yet with the potential to become anything. Think about how abstract this concept is. Anaximander was proposing that reality emerges from something that has no specific qualities, but contains the possibility of all qualities. When something is completely undefined, he argued, it has the power to become anything defined. But Anaximander wasn't content to just theorize about invisible first principles. He also revolutionized how people thought about the Earth's place in the cosmos. Every ancient civilization had imagined the Earth as sitting on something, a giant turtle, massive pillars, or as Thales thought, floating on an ocean. But Anaximander proposed something that sounds remarkably modern. The Earth doesn't rest on anything. It floats freely in space, held in place simply because it's equidistant from everything around it. This was mind-blowing. Anaximander had intuited, 2,600 years ago, that Earth is a celestial body floating in space, an insight that wouldn't be proven until thousands of years later. His ideas about the sun, moon, and stars were equally fascinating, if strange by our standards. He imagined them as giant wheels of fire spinning around the Earth, with holes that allowed the light to shine through. The stars were the nearest wheels with many small holes. The moon was farther away with one medium-sized hole. The sun was the most distant wheel with one large hole. While this sounds bizarre to us, consider what Anaximander got right. The sun is farther from Earth than the moon. Both are massive sources of light and heat, and Earth exists in a space filled with celestial bodies. For someone with no telescopes or modern instruments, these were extraordinary insights. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Anaximander's work is a cryptic quote that has survived from his writings, the only direct words we have from him. All things must, in justice, decline again toward that from which they had their origin. For they must give satisfaction and atonement for injustice, each in the order of time. What did he mean by this? Was he describing some cosmic law of justice that governs the universe? Was he suggesting that existence itself is a kind of injustice that must eventually be balanced? Scholars have been debating this for over 2,000 years. What's clear is that Anaximander had introduced the idea that the universe operates according to impersonal, rational laws that humans can potentially understand. This was a revolutionary concept that would influence philosophy and science for millennia. But our story of intellectual revolution in Miletus isn't over. There was a third thinker who disagreed with both Thales and Anaximander, and he was about to propose yet another radical theory about the nature of reality. Anaximenes had grown up listening to the debates between Thales and Anaximander. He respected both men but found problems with both their theories. Thales's water seemed too limited. How could one element really account for everything? But Anaximander's apeiron seemed too abstract. How could something completely indefinite and unobservable be the cause of the very definite, observable world around us? Anaximenes needed something concrete enough to be real, yet flexible enough to explain all the transformations he saw in nature. And then he had his breakthrough moment: air. At first, this might seem like a step backward. Hadn't Anaximander already shown why no single element could be the first principle? But Anaximenes had a unique insight about air that made all the difference. He realized that air completely surrounds us. We live and breathe in it constantly. When you look up at the sky, you're seeing what appears to be an infinite expanse of air. But most importantly, Anaximenes observed that air could undergo two fundamental processes that explained everything in nature: condensation and rarefaction. When air becomes more condensed, more tightly packed together, it gets cooler and heavier. First, it becomes wind, then clouds, then water, then mud, and finally solid earth and stone. But when air becomes rarefied, spread out and less dense, it gets hotter and lighter, eventually becoming fire. Do you see the brilliance of this theory? Anaximenes had found a way to explain every element and every natural transformation through a single observable process: changes in the density of air. Hot and cold, wet and dry, solid and gas. Everything could be understood as air in different states of compression. But Anaximenes had discovered something even more profound. The universe is fundamentally about change. Nothing is static. Everything is constantly transforming from one state to another according to natural laws. The cosmos isn't a fixed structure created by the gods. It's a dynamic process of continuous transformation. This insight was revolutionary. For centuries, people had lived in fear of unpredictable change, attributing it to the whims of capricious gods. Anaximenes was saying that change follows natural patterns that can be understood and even predicted. These three men, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, had accomplished something extraordinary in the space of just a few decades. They had taken a universe dominated by mythological explanations and transformed it into a rational cosmos governed by natural laws. They had replaced the arbitrary will of the gods with comprehensible principles that human reason could grasp. But more than that, they had invented an entirely new way of thinking about reality. They had established the revolutionary idea that the universe makes sense, that it follows logical patterns, and that human beings have the capacity to figure out how it works. They had created what we now call the scientific method: observe the world carefully, propose explanations based on natural causes, test those explanations against evidence, and be willing to change your mind when better explanations emerge. Think about the courage this required. In a world where questioning the gods was dangerous, where traditional explanations had the weight of centuries behind them, where admitting you were wrong could make you a social outcast, these three men chose intellectual honesty over social comfort. They chose truth over tradition. The impact of what happened in Miletus cannot be overstated. Every scientific discovery, every technological breakthrough, every moment when a researcher follows evidence rather than authority, all of it traces back to these three men who first dared to explain the world through reason rather than myth. But their legacy goes far beyond science and technology. They taught us something profound about what it means to be human. They showed us that we don't have to accept explanations just because they're traditional or popular, that we have the right, even the responsibility, to think for ourselves, that changing your mind when presented with better evidence isn't a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. When Galileo looked through his telescope and saw that Jupiter had moons, challenging the Earth-centered view of the universe, he was following in the footsteps of Thales, who dared to challenge the God-centered view of earthquakes. When Darwin proposed that species evolved through natural selection rather than divine creation, he was walking a path first blazed by Anaximander, who suggested that all things emerge from natural processes rather than divine intervention. When Einstein showed that space and time are relative rather than absolute, he was continuing the intellectual journey begun by Anaximenes, who demonstrated that what seems solid and permanent is actually in constant flux. The questions these ancient Greeks asked are the same ones we're still asking today. What is the fundamental nature of reality? How can we distinguish between what's true and what merely seems true? What can human reason accomplish and what are its limits? Modern physicists searching for a theory of everything are essentially looking for their own version of the arche, the first principle that explains all of reality. When they talk about quantum fields or vibrating strings as the foundation of existence, they're engaged in the same quest that began in Miletus 2,600 years ago. The flame that Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes lit in ancient Greece still burns today. Every time a scientist forms a hypothesis, every time a researcher questions an established theory, every time someone chooses evidence over authority, they're keeping that flame alive. But perhaps most importantly, these three men showed us that the universe is not only comprehensible, it's beautiful. The same rational principles that govern the movement of stars also govern the growth of plants and the flow of rivers. The same natural laws that explain why water freezes also explain why hearts beat and why planets orbit the sun. They revealed that we live in a cosmos, an ordered, harmonious universe that rewards careful observation and logical thinking with profound insights into the nature of reality itself. The moment human thought shifted forever wasn't marked by dramatic fanfare or world-shaking events. It happened quietly, in the minds of three curious men walking the streets of an ancient city, asking simple but revolutionary questions about the world around them. Their greatest gift to us wasn't any particular theory about water or air or the boundless. Their greatest gift was showing us that we have the power to understand our universe through reason, observation, and honest inquiry. They lit a flame of intellectual courage that has burned for 2,600 years and shows no sign of going out. Every time we choose curiosity over certainty, every time we follow evidence wherever it leads, every time we dare to think for ourselves, we honor their memory and continue their revolution. The moment human thought shifted forever began in ancient Greece. But it continues today in every mind brave enough to ask, what if there's a better explanation? The philosophers lit the flame. Now it's up to us to keep it burning.